Trio, Loop, and Android APS are three of the most popular and well-regarded open source systems, which many patients are opting to use over FDA-cleared systems. The apps unlock advanced customization features, caregiver controls for parents, adaptive algorithms, and tighter targets for diabetes management. Welcome to the show. I'm Justin. I have type 1 diabetes, and on here I talk all things diabetes tech, news, and management with physicians, tech leaders, and those thriving with diabetes and using the tech themselves. Today is part 2 of a 2-part series where myself and open source specialists are unpacking all there is to know about open source systems. My 2 guests are both certified diabetes care and education specialists who have type 1 diabetes and use open source apps themselves. They help patients adopt to these systems through their work at Integrated Diabetes Services. On last week's episode, we got into specifics on open source features such as caregiver controls, Siri Shortcuts, geofencing, and how these apps are built, and how the systems compare to FDA-cleared systems. So watch that if you haven't seen it. Today we compare DIY Loop to Trio and Android APS and explain how each of these algorithms function differently, how they are controlled, what the interface looks like, and which may be the best option for your lifestyle and goals. Keep in mind that anything you hear on this podcast or any of my channels is not medical advice. It's for educational purposes only. Always consult with a physician before making changes to your healthcare. Open source apps are experimental and not approved by the FDA or regulatory authorities. You take full responsibility for building and using these apps, and you do so at your own risk. All right, and we are back. Episode 1 was so fun. And now we're going to dive deeper into kind of the big players. Let's start with who are using these or why someone should use one over the other. What are you kind of seeing when it comes to these options that are available and who kind of chooses which?
Well, I would love to be able to pick for people, but can't. But I think Trio is an incredible option. In my opinion, the best option for people that are on a GLP-1 and want to do, not have to do announced meals. You can do this with Loop, but I feel like just the algorithm and the way it functions is so great for that group of people. And then I would also choose Trio for people that follow that low carb lifestyle. I think that it can handle the protein fat, and you have a lot of customization in handling that with the Trio app.
And I would say the combination of a low carb lifestyle coupled with a GLP-1 is really beautiful, just with that algorithm, not necessarily having to announce meals.
Yeah, and what else? Beyond medications that people are on or goals, what about lifestyles that people have? How is that affecting it? Or the makeup of the family, right?
Right. I don't know if it's lifestyle per se, but it's the individual. I think that both options are fantastic and both algorithms can handle a lot. And I've seen people who are low carb on the auto bolus branch of Loop, and they have beautiful success equal to Trio. So it really just depends on the individual. I think of algorithms and pump shopping almost similar to driving, picking out a new car. You need off-road, driving. I, live in Dallas, Texas. It's flat. I don't need that feature. And so what are you looking for the most? And if you're trying to just get the most out of an algorithm, I think that starting with Loop, maybe you go towards Trio for that more customization approach.
Let's start with Loop's algorithm. And I know that there are a few options when it comes to this. So can you kind of lay out the options of algorithm on Loop and how each of them work?
So I think the very first thing to remember is both algorithms are setting based. If you are starting with basal rates that are not accurate for you, correction factors, insulin sensitivity that are not accurate for you, you're going to have a harder time going into these systems. But I think Loop really looks in terms of delivery in four things, and Trio also, but it's calculating how much insulin has already been delivered, how much insulin on board. It's calculating the carbs on board, which is really different from any other commercially available system. It's looking at the directional arrows of your Dexcom, so predicting where in the future your blood sugars are going, and that's how it's changing the delivery of insulin. And then there's a small retrospective approach to the algorithm. And so understanding those four pieces of it, I think, helps people know how to interact with it. The main branch of Loop is using temporary basal adjustments. And so it's increasing the basal rate, it's decreasing the basal rate. And then, of course, you can give more insulin for meals, more insulin for corrections. But there is a second option in just the main branch, and it's called the auto bolus branch. And that is micro boluses that are similar in delivery to Trio. It's giving a little bit more insulin up front, so blood sugars react and change a little bit faster just because the insulin is delivered sooner than a temporary basal. And that's kind of Loop in a nutshell.
And does the auto bolus, is that additive to a temp basal change? Does it do both with that one, or it
does both?
One does temp basal?
If you use auto bolus, then when you're going above target, it's going to auto delivery. It's not going to increase your basal, but if you're trending down, then it will pull from basal.
Okay. So I'll show my screen. I don't know how well it is, but you'll see on here there's temporary adjustments along with the boluses, and it's reducing my basal.
Yeah, and you can use, so when you're using auto bolus in just itself, it's going to do 40% of your programmed insulin sensitivity factor. But then we also have with Loop what's called algorithm experiments, and that'll do anywhere from 20% to 80% with the glucose-based partial application factor. And then you can also do a manually code customization where you tell it, well, instead of doing 40%, I want it to always do 80%. So you kind of have options.
Is that the integral retrospective correction setting?
That's the glucose-based partial application setting. The integral retrospective correction setting is a build-on of retrospective correction, and that is looking at your glucose and helping to better pick up on things, better respond to glucose in changes in it. So it can better help pick up on unannounced stress or physical activity, right, or maybe
would it be like unannounced meal technology you see in the 780G?
Yeah, I kind of see the spectrum of, temp basal branch is a little more gentle, and then you've got the auto bolus branch, and then you've got the algorithm experiment, and then if you want even more customization, Trio would kind of be along that spectrum.
Interesting. Yeah, so if there's anyone out there similar to me, like I haven't used Loop in nearly a year. That didn't exist when I was last on.
You would notice a difference from before.
Yeah, because one thing I want to focus on in this episode is, the difference in how people are, and not only the algorithm, but the amount of freedom people get back. And Trio, or the OREF algorithm, has been known to be an algorithm that allows people to, if the settings are done correctly, which isn't easy, set it and forget it and truly not pre-bolus. Many people still pre-bolus, but many people are getting 65%, 70, 80, 90% not pre-bolusing. But knowing that Loop, it's great to see that Loop is continuing to grow and evolve and bringing out these new algorithm features that, are working to do the same. Does Loop have any dynamic settings? Does the app learn from you and adapt like Trio does?
The answer is yes and no to that. So that's kind of a tough question. But there's retrospective and integral retrospective correction are kind of, in a way, you could argue that they are. But mostly it's no. It's not.
It is not AI.
Yeah, it doesn't have as much of a learning response than like what Trio would have. But I wanted to go back to something that you had said before, a point that I want to make, because I think a lot of people have some frustration, they switch over to Trio. And if they're not in these special categories of being a low carb eater or being on something that delays digestion, and then they try to do unannounced meals, their blood sugar is going to go up to 250, 300 because our insulin, there's no way to
Right.
make it faster right now. We
Right.
have what we have for insulin. So if you're not on something that's going to slow down the impact, or you're eating high glycemic foods that impact your blood sugar quickly, you're still going to have a significant post-meal rise.
We have these unbelievable algorithms, amazing technology, predictive, continuous glucose monitors, but we're using the same insulin that we used, 20 years ago. And so that insulin is still needing a pre-bolus if you're having high glycemic foods. It's still something that once it's delivered in your system, you can't take it out if you're all of a sudden going for, a spontaneous walk or workout. And so I do think that's something that people forget quite often because we have such amazing technology, but the insulin is not all that amazing.
Yeah. Well, and people see people posting online so often, and they're like, but I saw so and so posting online that they do unannounced meals and their time in range is 80%. And then it's like, yeah, well, I know that person, and let me tell you what else they're using in addition. And they're very open
Right.
about it. So if you
Yeah.
dig deeper, you can find that information.
Yeah, and I had a whole podcast episode about a year ago on the ORIF algorithm, and my interviewee was using it, eating whatever she wants, Cinnabons, donuts, whatever, high carb diet, not announcing meals, getting 85% in range, but was also on a GLP-1.
Exactly.
So there are so many factors to control, and everyone's different.
Someone who's having some of those sweeter, higher glycemic foods might tolerate a sharp spike in their blood sugar and wait for it to come down and be completely comfortable with that. And then there's other people that just causes a lot of anxiety and discomfort, so they're not comfortable with it.
Do you know of anyone or people using Loop without touching it, really, without putting in meals in or pre-bolusing?
I do have a few folks that are using the auto bolus branch on Loop and don't announce meals and do well. That is definitely not the norm, though. I wouldn't want to give that expectation.
Yeah, I think what will likely become more of a norm with Loop that kind of you can get pretty great outcomes with is the favorite foods feature, which is not in quite yet. But with that, what they'll be able to do is you don't have to carb count. And some people have even suggested that they could use it as, well, you plug in something for small, medium, large, kind of like the eyelid idea. And you're just tapping on one of them to enter in. Because I
do that quite a bit, with people who just are forgetting or just, they really struggle with carb counting.
Something that I had a difficult time with on Loop is, there was the ability to log glycemic index, which is very specific to the app. You can, there's 3 options. I mean, you can choose how many hours you can set the hours for intake. But I still found that I would eat pizza or a burger and fries, put in that I had it high fat. The carb count was right. It felt right. But I'd still get stuck high. And I felt like I needed an extended bolus. I needed to, an hour later put in a certain percentage, whatever. And I don't know. And I know a lot of people also find themselves putting in fake carbs. It's something I hear about a lot with Loop.
It's probably not fake carbs necessarily. It's probably the need for a protein and fat bolus and manipulation. And so if you're having a really large protein diet or protein meal, sometimes 50% of those protein grams will convert into glucose depending on the other carbs that you're having with the meal. And so I do think that there is that frustration. I do hear that quite a bit, but it's understanding maybe some of the meals and metabolism factors, and that's not always something that people dive into.
So if you go into Trio, you're going to want to enter in the protein fat content of that meal that you had, because it is going to have that delayed impact, like Dana said. And that's something that's really cool about Trio is The default for protein fat is using what's called the Warsaw method. So if you don't know what that
Right.
is, do a quick Google search. But you can actually change the percentage because the percentage doesn't work for everyone. Sometimes you might need
Right.
less of a percentage for you specifically from a protein standpoint.
And
And then
that
another
means
thing,
like the percentage of if there's 10 grams of protein or fat, this is my percentage of how much that will turn into
Yeah.
glucose.
right? Exactly.
You're just more
And
insulin resistant after that high fat meal for a small amount of time. And so it just makes sense that you would need more insulin.
Yeah,
yeah,
about
what
60.
are
Yeah.
some other unique features to Loop? We've got the favorite foods. What are some other things that users are getting able to take advantage of when it comes to Loop?
And a lot of this stuff, it does kind of go with both. Like with Loop and with Trio, you have both specific features. But I think a lot of people with Loop, they like the ease of overrides. Overrides, they're just super straightforward. They're easy to put on. You get emojis.
And what are the overrides? What can you explain to everyone?
Within overrides, you can put as many in as you want, and you're setting them for different scenarios, such as high fat. Like I have a high fat profile, so if I have a high fat meal, I'm going to turn that on. You might have an override with just a target blood sugar change. So maybe for some light activity, you put
Traveling, walking a lot. Yeah.
stress, sick days, all examples of things that you would have an override for. Recess for your kid.
A lot of women have hormone overrides. Just being insulin resistant at certain times of the month is really just life changing for some women.
Well, and something super unique to Loop, at least right now, because I know Trio is working to bring this, and I don't know about AAPS. I'd be curious to know is caregiver functionality. I know that there's Loop Follow and then there's Loop Control. Can you kind of tell me what these are, how they differ, and what's available now? Let's start with that, but then I want to go to what's available on Trio and AAPS.
So caregiver, this essentially it's very similar in the way it looks to the Loop application. So if you are a parent and you're using remote configuration, a lot of them prefer to use the caregiver app. Everything can be done through Night Scout. So you do not need the caregiver app. And Night Scout is honestly, it's a more reliable way of doing it. It's more likely to go through utilizing Night Scout. But that's not to say that caregiver isn't great. It is absolutely lovely. But it is for putting through these overrides that you have set. So you have to have the override set in advance if you want to turn that on from afar. You can enter carbs and you can bolus. You always want to do them reverse though with these. That's something really important to point out because if you enter the carb first, then their system is probably going to start responding to that carb entry. So then if you give that bolus, well, now you probably wind up with too much insulin on board. So you do it backwards. You deliver the bolus and then you enter the carbs if you're doing that. So if you're doing it in Night Scout, what makes the caregiver application so much easier and so much better is that we have what's called the one-time password for using these remote features. And the one-time password, if you're doing that in Night Scout, what you have to do is get an app on the phone that generates this one-time password for you. So some kind of authenticator app. The one I use personally is called Duo. There's like Google Authenticator. Some are free, some you have to pay money for. I use Duo because I had it from school and I knew it was free. So you put in the QR code, you scan the QR code from the Looper's phone that's under Night Scout, and this will generate that for you. But you still have to go into that Authenticator app, pull that one-time password, and get it into Night Scout fast enough. Whereas with Caregiver, you scan that QR code once, now you've added that Looper, and you don't think about the one-time password ever again, unless for whatever reason you have to do it in Night Scout.
Where are people using Loop Caregiver? Is this are they using it on their computer or is this an app on their phone?
On their
Snap.
phone. Built just
And is that an
like-
app you build just like you
Yes.
build the other
Yes.
ones? GitHub,
Yes.
browser build.
Loop Follow, you also have to build, just like Loop and Caregiver. So that's another one. You can just get a little bit more easy information. It has a special, I have it on my phone that I can.
So Loop Follow really is just a way to see information. There are no control. You can't set
You can.
You can't
Right.
set things, can you? Oh,
So
okay.
here's what it looks like. I don't have a looper in here. So a lot of people like this just because of, the easy, you getting a clear view of insulin on board, carb on board and stuff. But yes, within it, so now you can go over to Night Scout. And then once you're in Night Scout, now you have the ability to do remote configuration from there. So when you have Night Scout, what you do is there's usually going to be a lock at the top right hand corner. You click on that lock and you type in your API secret, and then a plus sign will come up, and you hit the plus sign, and then the last four options are what you use. It'll say remote carb entry, remote bolus, set temporary override, cancel temporary override, and you put them within there. What you can also do is within the three lines at the top right hand corner, and why some people like Night Scout, because there's no calculator in Caregiver. So that really throws people off. You have to self calculate. If you go into Night Scout, if you click the three lines and you go down as plugins, there's something called Bolus Wizard. So you click that check mark, and now you have a calculator. It's calculated a little differently than what's in the Loop app, but you can type in carbs that they're going to consume, and it'll use their settings to give you the insulin dose recommendation. So that's really helpful.
So why is someone choosing to use Caregiver over Follow or vice versa?
Probably, I think the big thing is that one-time password situation. It's just so much easier. It's much more straightforward. They're used to seeing something that looks very similar on a child's phone. So it's very user-friendly.
Now let's get into Trio. So can you kind of explain to me what makes the OREF algorithm that powers Trio, and again, this is AAPS as well, what's so unique about that algorithm?
It's going to bring out the Gen Z in me. It goes hard.
It does. And so, when I moved from Loop to Trio, I had to do massive adjustments with my settings that I knew 100% were accurate in Loop. And then it was just too strong in Trio. And I had to really back off. I, really had a hard time because there's, in Trio, you really don't want to give corrections. You want to let the algorithm kind of push the insulin for you. And so it almost does better with less interaction from the user. And I just have control issues with my diabetes. And so I had a hard time keeping my hands off,
Well,
right?
And why is that? Why do you need to let it do its thing?
Because it has the unannounced meal component, also has the SMBG, and it's just a more aggressive. It's taking into account your total daily dose of insulin from previous days, and it's really applying that to deliver the insulin a little bit more robustly. And normally, I would say that more insulin is aggressive in a positive way, but it just really, I think it takes some time for people to navigate the settings on that.
Yeah, you have control over everything. You get to choose, well, how long do you want these SMB minutes to be for? What percentage do you want it to go for?
Right.
So, of course,
there's also a percentage of how much bolus you get up front, and then do you let the system take over? It's that fat protein bolus also that we were talking about earlier, which, just you can customize all of it to exactly what you want.
So SMBs, super micro boluses, can you explain to everyone, these are little boluses, but they're super, that come out to, help get ahead of things. How is that different than what you're seeing in Loop? Or is there like overlap in what that's doing with the, the auto bolus feature in Loop?
Yeah, so with Loop, most people are going to use it at its default. Most people in Loop are saying, I'm going to use it with 40% all the time. And all the time, it's doing the same thing. Now more people are using Algorithm Experiment, where it's automatically shifting it for you. With Trio, like, the world is your oyster. So I'm just going to show you.
So you can increase how much it's delivering, and you can see on Catherine's phone.
Look
you can adjust all of that.
So we have all of these preferences.
The settings list is crazy.
It's crazy. But then just SMB specific. These are just SMB settings. So I don't know if you want to do the counting.
An entire screen.
That's it.
Or
Yeah. It's more than a
yeah.
screen. It doesn't even fit on just one screen.
And tell us a little bit more about the dynamic settings. Can you kind of walk us through the different areas of settings that are able to adjust, and kind of what information, how often is that happening?
Yeah, and this is an important thing to know is this doesn't work right away. Like, how is it going to be
Right.
dynamic when it doesn't even know you? You just started using the app, so this is going to be over time.
You really do need to keep it off, let the system understand how much insulin it's actually delivering before putting that on.
Yeah, and you can delete data. Like, let's say you have, and this is something that also makes Trio so great with like the Omnipod 5. You have a day where you use like way more insulin because you got a steroid shot. There's no way to tell it that was just temporary. With Trio, you can say, delete, don't use this day. Something weird happened. This
Right.
isn't, don't ever take this into consideration again.
Yeah, and on
And then,
that note, something that we haven't brought up is on both Trio and Loop, you're able to delete like a meal, or adjust how many
Oh,
carbs you
edit your meal
actually ate,
entries.
which has
Yeah.
been the oh my god, like I went out with my Omnipod 5 the other day and I entered, like 50 grams of carbs because I was going to go with ice cream. I forget what it was. I was getting ice cream. I got there and the ice cream shop was closed. And I was like, all right, like
Ruh-roh.
I
Yeah.
can't just delete this. I'm stuck with fit, what the
Right.
app, the algorithm can't adjust to that. Um, so that's like a huge thing with this. And Tidepool Loop, the cleared loop system, does have the ability to adjust carbs within 1 hour, which is exciting on the the
Right.
FDA cleared twist pump. So I'm happy to hear that some FDA cleared system will have the ability to adjust that. So now with the dynamic settings, how often do you know what period of time that's like it's adjusting these settings every 5 minutes, right?
yeah, well, if you
Yeah.
have them on. And then it's also, so default is
Okay.
sigmoid function is going to be off, but sigmoid, it tends to work really nicely. It's a little bit more aggressive for women, especially. So a lot of people will turn that on, and then you're going to see a little bit different of a functionality. Um, so that's a whole other thing that you explore.
So we talked about profiles on Loop. What is that mechanic on and overrides on Loop? What is that
Overrides,
mechanic on
that's
Trio?
what,
How are people creating different profiles or whatever, and what are they called?
yeah.
It's
So
really the same.
it's, well, on Trio, you actually have two options, but they're very similar. So you have
Mhm.
temp target, or what's often referred to as TTs, and you have profiles. So TTs, you don't have those that more options that we talked about, where you can turn some things off and keep on what you want. TTs, it's simply you're setting a different target blood sugar, whereas profiles, now you can go and you can change overall insulin needs and get that more customized outcome to what you want to be setting.
And it kind of makes sense, right? The profile itself is really different. You're not just adjusting a single profile like in Loop and overriding it up or down, but you can really make very different settings if you have a very different insulin need for certain times of the month, weekends, work days. If you're a shift worker, there's just a lot more flexibility with that.
With Android APS, is it pretty much the same when it comes to settings? Maybe not the same look, but is it like the same
All
exact?
these all these fun preferences, yes.
Right.
Okay. Does AAPS give you any extra features? Android allows you to do so many things on that phone. Is there anything special when it comes to, widgets or anything on Android?
It's always they're always a little bit further advanced. Yeah, they're always a step ahead, I guess you could say.
I know. I think things are catching up with the live notifications, things that maybe we didn't have in the last, operating system update.
Yeah, but
Okay.
yeah, historically it was always Android was further advanced, always had some
But now
features.
I feel like Trio looks really similar to it.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely
Today's episode is sponsored by T1D Exchange. You can directly make an impact on diabetes healthcare, treatments, and technology by participating in the T1D Exchange registry. It starts with a simple survey about your life with T1D, and it only takes about 15 minutes. After that, you'll have a personal portal with ongoing T1D study and survey opportunities. Plus, some of these studies even offer compensation. Signing up with the link in the show notes helps support my channel, and it allows me to continue putting out free content. You can sign up at t1dexchange.org/diabetic or click that link in today's show notes. I think a big sticking point for people with any open source is switching between one system to another. What are you seeing here? Let's start with kind of Loop. Where are people coming from, and kind of how should they navigate this switch to Loop?
Well, one thing that a lot of loopers are previous Omnipod users because they're just comfortable with the pods and they want a patch pump. And the Omnipod 5 system doesn't have fixed basal rates the way that the open source systems really do need to have a tested and optimized basal rate. And so that's one thing that, when we work with someone transitioning from a commercial system to the open source, we want to make sure that those basal rates are kind of set, because these are setting based algorithms. Even if they're not staying in a basal rate all the time, it's definitely still playing into total daily dose of insulin. It's definitely playing into profiles. And so that's one thing. And then, some of these other more aggressive, and I mean that again in a positive way, delivery of insulins really are impacted the most by insulin sensitivity. And I think that's something that people don't really understand really well. I work with a lot of people who just have never changed that number. Their doctor gave it to them when they were diagnosed, and they've just never adjusted that. And so really understanding that as a concept and then understanding it as a setting, I think is sometimes a barrier to success.
What would kind of be your advice to someone who is, planning the switch to Loop? What would you tell them to expect when doing that?
A little bit of a time to dial things in. It might get worse before it gets better initially because of where you're coming from. And a lot of times before they transition, if we're talking to them, we encourage them to do some setting testing. They can do it on Loop too once they transition. So
Sure.
if they're eager to get there. But so a lot of times there's just waiting period of needing to switch to the dash from the Omnipod 5. So we can go into manual mode and we can test things out and see where settings should be to get them in a good place starting Loop.
Do you think if someone's going to go to open source and they want to do Trio, would you ever recommend someone start with Loop, or is that not necessary? Like, is there an advantage to starting with Loop, or they're pretty different, but maybe just like kind of the build and I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
It just really depends on the individual and their ability to, kind of deep dive into these customizations, not get overwhelmed with them. We always want to make sure that someone has a really good foundation of diabetes education and understanding, because if you don't have that, it's really hard to then go to these advanced technologies. I think it also depends, were they on an automated insulin delivery system before? Are they going just from shots straight to Trio? I mean, that's a big jump. And so, and then kind of what the features they're looking for, kind of have to play into the whole story.
Yeah. What about people who are switching from Loop to Trio? What should they expect here? I know it's not as simple as just plugging in the exact same stuff. What are you kind of seeing? What's the trends there that you're seeing that people are, when they're switching over, what are they typically needing to adjust in kind of what way?
There's actually a really great documentation on this, and even a video for users that are switching from Loop to Trio. And that is the the perfect place to refer them if they're even thinking about it. Like, this is what to expect. This is where you're going to want to set things initially. And then, I mean, a little bit of a difference is with Trio, your settings do become less important. So initially, kind of working with them, and then it just kind of falls into place.
I want to spend the rest of our time kind of getting into some of the settings for each one, especially with Trio. This can be a sticking point, but kind of some of the common things you're seeing with these, and for people who are listening who just started, kind of something they can take away for working on with their transition. So when it comes to Loop, what are some of the common issues that people face when they first get on it, and kind of how should they navigate those?
I mean, when people are coming from multiple daily injections, we first need to start with that basal insulin because they've just been taking shots for their basal insulin, and so we first need to get that a little bit more optimized. And then, depending, sometimes you may not be using a carb ratio, you may not be using a correction factor or an insulin sensitivity factor that can really be plugged in to the system. And so starting with that, with MDI or multiple daily injections, I mean, for Omnipod 5, I think a lot of people, because it's a conservative algorithm in how much it's delivering, I think people increase how much insulin they get at meal times. And so oftentimes their carb ratio is a little bit too strong when they then move to Loop, especially because they're getting assistance now with Loop making adjustments after that meal. So those are two things that kind of come straight to mind. Tandem is a little bit more of an easier shift, I would say. Unless somebody has several profiles that they're using with their Tandem devices, and then Loop wouldn't offer that, but Trio would.
Another difference is a lot of people, I see them playing tug of war when they switch over to these open source systems. So they're so used to being so involved, like, again, especially with the Omnipod 5, like they have to be in all the time trying to help it learn and get better outcomes. So with Loop, they're in their app constantly, or with Trio, they're in their app constantly, which is also worth mentioning that if you click that bolus sign right now in Trio, it's not properly calculating the outside insulin on board, and you can really get yourself into trouble.
Right.
So, but with Loop, if you're delivering insulin that's not recommended, then the Loop system is going to pull your basal for an extended period of time. It's going to say your predicted blood sugar is like negative 365. And people panic when they see this. But the reason it says that is because, well, your settings told Loop, now your settings matter, that you didn't need that insulin. So because you gave it, you're fighting.
And I also do think that coming from some systems into Loop and Trio, and it's looking 6 hours out, and in 6 hours you're not going to be negative 368 because you're going to do something about that. And so it's not, people look at the graphs in Loop and they really have a knee-jerk reaction to do something really, really quickly without the understanding that that is predicting many hours in advance.
Do you have patients who are on Afrezza also on these apps? I know in Loop you can log Afrezza insulin. Can you log Afrezza insulin in Trio? And what are these patients? What's their experience? Do you like seeing people on Afrezza with these?
Well, right now the easiest to use Afrezza with is Loop. Because you can go in and you say log insulin delivery, you put that drop down in, select Afrezza. It's built in there, so it's very
super easy. Yeah.
And yeah, so I love Afrezza with Loop. It's great for kind of like that really screwed up, or I'm eating now.
Or a bad site. Yeah.
Yeah.
You have like a little bit of an issue. We use glucagon and sugar for low blood sugars, and I see Afrezza as a rescue for high blood sugars in some cases. So I think it's great to use it with any pump if you're understanding how to use it.
Let's go over a few of the settings. I know there's so many, but some of the settings in Trio, AAPS, the ORF algorithm. What do you often see? Well, first of all, how are people when they first get on? How are they faring? Like, Are people having a lot of trouble as soon as they get on, or
Some people, like, they start up and it's beautiful from the start. Others, it is rocky, really up and down. And I think a nice example of that is around the same exact time, there was four of us that we worked together. We're all colleagues. Four of us started at around the exact same time. And it was 50-50. So Dana and I, oof,
Yeah.
not
And I
good.
will say there was a moment where I was like, this is beautiful. I love this. I am drinking the Kool-Aid and I'm going to stick with this. And then, like I said, I was on this 2-week hiking trip and I was low, 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 low. And no matter how much insulin I subtracted out, I was still getting too much. So it wasn't a great time to do it.
yeah?
But it really does depend, I think. And I would say that with all automated insulin delivery systems, there is a window where people are like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. It's almost like you have a beautiful honeymoon for about 3-4 days, and then you're like, oh, the reality actually sets in and it's not a cure. I gotta work for my diabetes management again.
Yeah, and I find I get the same thing where something can be terrible for 3 days, and then it really, and that's why I said I think earlier in this episode, it's like it does take 1 to 2, 3 months to have for trial and error and really getting used to using it and having, especially with Trio, having it learn you.
You're inviting technology to be a very personal, intimate partner with you in diabetes management. And so it just makes sense that you have to trust that partner. You have to learn to communicate with that partner, just like any other, kind of partnership in your life that, if you're putting in fake carbs and you're lying to your partner, well, that's a whole other issue. And so I do think a month or 3 months takes that long to develop that trust and understanding.
So for someone getting on Trio, never and hasn't used open source before, what are kind of the guidelines? I know that there's like a step-by-step kind of way to do it. What does that look like, and is that how you kind of help people get on slowly turning on? Like,
Yeah.
what does that look
Yes.
like?
Yeah, that's exactly what they have there. It's there because that's what works best. Like, they are completely right. You don't want to go trigger crazy, turning everything on at the very beginning. So going in and starting with the recommended points where these settings should be is how you're going to see the best outcome.
Leaving off, the dynamic, just kind of learning the system. At least, I think the recommendation is what, 7 days.
Between the two, they have very different looks and styles. I will say Trio has a new interface coming out. I talked about it in my Trio episode. I showed off screenshots. That's version 1.0, but currently it's version 0.2. What kind of, at least right now, if someone were to go try out the two now, between the two, can you just kind of tell me a little bit about how both of them look?
Loop is much prettier. It's
a little bit more streamlined.
Yeah, in the way that it looks, it's pretty straightforward in where you're going for each thing. Whereas Trio right now, you kind of have to click to find what you're looking for still. I would say one thing.
It has a little bit more abbreviations that may not be, fully intuitive to everybody using it.
Also with Trio, if you move too fast, you can get yourself into trouble with just even at a point of entering carbs. It's kind of like every aspect of Trio you want to take slow. For example, when I use Trio, I constantly accidentally hit save without bolus, or I don't think that's the wording for it. Yeah, continue without bolus is what it says. I'm not paying attention. I just click on that, and then I'm behind because I did not enact my bolus by accident. So you need to pay attention.
And then also that correction, because it is so robust in insulin delivery, if you are not patient to let the system give you the correction that you need and actually go in and maybe even try to overthink or manually enter things, you are going to end up in a little bit of trouble with too much insulin.
Yeah. Can you speak to the importance of, why changing only one setting at a time, like why that's important, and kind of how long does that need to kind of happen before someone then takes that information and, what should they be looking for and kind of how should they continue from there?
It's kind of like, when you do all the things, how are you going to know which one of all the things
Right.
screwed you?
And I do think that people get in that knee-jerk reaction of my blood sugar's high, I have to change all my settings now. Well, then it's low, and then they got to change all the settings. And so really looking for patterns, and that I know is something that Catherine and I do a lot when we're working with people, is just, let's see if this is an overwhelming theme and a pattern, not necessarily that knee-jerk reaction.
I want to end with this from both of you. If you could have any feature, ability on all the open source apps or the one you use, what would that be?
Oh my gosh, taking a picture of some food and automatically having that carb count with the fat and the protein. I mean, I know that we're close with AI, but this is going to be really challenging. I'm a dietitian. I mean, I live and breathe carb counts, but I mean, that would be amazing.
Oh, that's such a
And
good
I think it would totally be possible. Yeah.
If we, the smart glasses, we already have LiDAR in our iPhone, in phones that, is giving depth to food. So yeah, AI with LiDAR, wearing it on our face, that would be
So
awesome.
I think I want, it's actually, I would say this is something that I want for all the systems, not even specifically for just open source. I want something that tells me or predicts how the absorption is going to be with that site. So something internally that's like, you got more of an inflammatory,
like red light, green light kind of thing.
Kind of like,
I
something,
like it.
Yeah, letting me know.
I mean, that's huge. That's something that we don't really, it's a known thing that some infusion sites can get bad over time, but there's no adjustment for that. And I do know what's exciting with the twist pump, at least it's not exactly the same, but the twist pump is supposed to notify way before other tube pumps or any pumps in general, tubeless too, about an issue with the infusion site of like no insulin going in by like 10 times faster or something.
Yeah. But I wanted to tell me like, this, you might need to pre-bolus a little bit longer with this particular site because we're detecting like a bigger bump that's gonna pocket your insulin a little bit longer.
Well, hopefully the powers that be heard all of what we had to say and they're gonna work on it, and probably the open source community that will come out with it first. Thank you both for coming on the show. This was fantastic. Episode 1 and 2, so much information. And then if people want to find you and work with you, on their transition between apps, like where can they go for that?
Well, luckily it's the same website. It's integrateddiabetes.com. Both Catherine and I have links there. So
our website pretty easy. It's under the process of being worked on. So if you want to just email us, you can do that.
This was fantastic, and I'd love to have you both on again for open source stuff as more stuff happens.
So fun.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Which open source app are you most interested in? Or do you think you're just gonna stick to an FDA cleared system? Let us know in the comments on YouTube. Personally, I've been using Omnipod 5, the cleared system, for about 3 months, and I'm pretty happy with it. I've tried Trio, I've used DIY Loop. Will I go back to those? Yes, I probably will, and I'll try those out because there's a few things with Omnipod 5 that aren't perfect, but I do love it. And it's great. To stay up to date on the latest in diabetes tech and content that comes out on here, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter. There will be a bunch of giveaways, but there will also be write-outs and articles on different types of tech that I'm seeing that I talk about. And if you want to connect with other people like you, people who love diabetes technology, they're on the cutting edge, they know what's going on, you should check out the Diabetech Community Discord. It's free to join. There's a link in the show notes. And on there, I've got channels for just about every piece of technology. Conversations going on where people are figuring out what's available to them and tips and tricks coming from the community. So go check that out. It's awesome. Until next time, I'm Justin, and I'll take you later.